I know that most people on the call understand and know what polarities are. And there was a video, I think, that was sent out that you can also watch afterwards. It's a very short 4-minute video. But, when we're talking about polarities today, in the world, there are things that are questions and puzzles that need to be solved that require an either or answer. But then there are also polarities. Polarities are situations in which two interdependent, and that's a very important word, states have to coexist over time, and in order for the system to be successful. And that's really, what we're talking about. Problems require either or thinking, and polarities, we use both and thinking. And when we think about some of the real polarized conversations that are happening, not just in the church, but in organizations and in the world and our political systems at large, many times it is because we are treating situations in which there are polarities as though they are problems. And we think that there is an either or solution. And that's when we really begin to get in trouble with one group pushing one way and one group pushing the other way. And we reach this stalemate and a place of stuckness, if you will. So today we want to look at a few of the polarities that pop up in the church that I think many of you have experienced day in and day out, and look a little bit at how can polarities help us understand those things a little better, and how can they help us to ask different questions so that we can be in richer dialogue with one another. So and Pablo, I know that you are translating, so I think I'll maybe tee this up, and then if you want to chime in, I think it's difficult for you to do both. And then, David and Sandra, if you'd like to chime in too, that'd be great. But 3 of the polarities that we know pop up a lot, and this comes out of the work that the discerning leadership team with all of you in their programs have really seen time and time again, is this idea of directive and participative, where what is our stance on guidance and leadership and direction, if you will? Does that come from above, from a place of authority, or does that come from a place where voices throughout the system and the church and communities determine the direction? And both of those are, in tension with one another. The idea of stability and adaptability, or perhaps, stability is, do we stand where we are grounded? Do we stand steady amidst all the change that is happening in the world? Or do we adapt? Are we an innovative voice that speaks and meets the needs of a changing world? And how do we navigate that? And then finally, well, not finally, but the third for today, because these are just several, is this idea of focusing on principles, focusing on rules, knowing that there is a truth that we can stand in, and that we stand there with strength and assuredness. And on the other side, focusing on mercy and grace, and understanding that we want to be open to consider and to seek other possibilities, and that both of those are in tension with one another. And I don't know, David or Sandra, if either of you want to comment on either of those. We're going to have everyone on the call in just a moment jump into a breakout to discuss them. But anything you might add, David? I see Sandra giving a no.
Yeah, I think that you and Pablo have really listened in carefully to the experience of our participants and really have discerned with us, I think, 3 of the key polarities. We know that there are so many. A big one, which we struggle with and which is very much at the heart of the work in the synod process, is unity and diversity. And it's one that will be a reoccurring question for us, perhaps throughout the call as well. But I think as we grapple with these questions of power and authority, participation, how to look at the need for continuity and at the same time innovation, and the openness to innovation, And this question around how we are in relationship to received tradition, especially the rules of received tradition, and the spirit of Jesus, which is constantly that of mercy, tenderness, compassion, tenderness being one of Pope Francis's favorite words. I feel like you've really captured here some pretty important paradoxes and polarities for us to work with today. Thanks very much.
Well, let's have everyone get a chance just to think and to wrap their minds around it. And as David, you underlined an important thing, which is that there are many more, right? Many more, and these are just three of them. So as we come back, would just be curious, perhaps in the chat, you can just put in some highlights of what are the impacts? Like, how do these polarities impact the conversations that you see happening? How do they impact the systems and the communities that you're a part of? Feel free to put those in the chat, and because we want to talk about what can you do about that, and what is a potential other way to be having these conversations. And so if you're like most people, there are lots of impacts that these things have. Is that they, I see in there it takes a lot of time, right? A lot of time, and we have value judgments about people. Actually, Lisa, your comment about people leaving, yeah, I mean that's what happens. Is that things can become so stuck, is that people will disengage and leave the conversation or leave the community, and yeah, so there's just all of these things that happen, and what's being put into the chat really are the stages. They are predictable stages that happen when the way that I frame it, when a polarity has us and we don't have it. Right, when we don't have a way to make sense of it, and it is driving the conversation, and we're not navigating it. So what we want to be able to do is to talk about how can we tap into this tension so that it becomes a creative force and not a destructive force in our communities. And so let me share my screen again. Again, I know that most people on this call are very familiar with polarities, and so that in a polarity there are benefits to each pole. So if we think about flexibility, their benefits are empowerment and creativity. But if you take it too far, and the key there is about going too far, those good things turn bad. And so too much flexibility gives us chaos and it gives us waste. And on the other side, there are also benefits and overuses. And one of the big things as we enter into dialogue about these polarities and how they impact, our conversation, is to really remember that this is not a list of pros and cons. It is not the good things and the bad things about either side. It's about the overuses, because there is nothing bad about flexibility. There are only bad things that happen if we have too much flexibility. There's nothing bad about structure, only negative things that can happen if we have too much structure. And so when we get into conversations where there are polarities involved, one of the biggest things is to help us remember is that it's not a list of pros and cons, right? There are actual things that are needed on both sides over time. And when we think about the third polarity that was on that list, the focus on principles, focus on rules, having a sense of truth that we stand in and hold to, and on the other side, focusing on mercy and grace and being open to other and new possibilities, there are benefits and overuses, obviously. So when we focus on principles and rules, and that becomes one of our drivers, is that then we have those things at the top. We've got moral clarity, right? We know that this is what we stand for. And so therefore there's consistency, because we're bought into those principles and those rules. Those things bring order and discipline and create a sense of tradition that we can stand on, right? And knowing who we are and what we are in the world. And those are all wonderful things. Taken too far, if that is the only lens that we use, then we can slip into things like legalism, right? It becomes like the Pharisees, right, of the 2000s, right? When we go too far, that way, when we become judgmental, we can become self-righteous because our principles are right, okay, and therefore we can have a lack of compassion for people who don't understand and who don't abide, right? And as a result of that, people within the community can begin to hide what's really going on if I don't fit the rules, right? And so therefore there's can be a bit of inauthenticity that's happening, because if I am who I really am, perhaps, right, I will be excommunicated, from the community, because we're so focused on principles and rules. Okay. On the other side, mercy and grace, the benefits are compassion, right? There's acceptance, there's space for reconciliation, there's space for healing, and as a result of that, if I know that it's okay, I can show up and be who I really am, right? And I will be accepted and loved, for that. And those are all wonderful things and can help us to be connected to one another. But taken too far, if we never pay attention to principles and rules, well, then there's no compass. There's nothing to guide us, because everything is okay, right? Everything. So everything becomes all right. And so there's no accountability. No one is held accountable for their actions, because there's always forgiveness. And so therefore, we might actually be perpetuating sin, and allowing that to happen, because we're not holding people to a higher standard. And those can become the overuses. So both have benefits and both have overuses. And this is just, there are many more benefits and overuses, and you may use different words and different terminologies for these, which would be just fine. What we want to do is let you have a chance to, make sense of this, because this is a real tension in all systems, but really in the church, right? It's one of the ones that is up, and we could call the poles different names also. But want to give you a chance in some groups just to talk about which of the benefits and which of the overuses stand out to you. When you look at the benefits and the overuses, which ones seem important? Which ones stand out or are really resonate? And you might even add, a benefit and overuse to each poll. What would you add as additional benefits and overuses? So, as some of you already know, that when there's a polarity, what our research shows is that typically we have a preference for one pole or the other. Okay, we know both are important, but at the end of the day, I lean a little more this way, or maybe a lot more. And so when that happens, if you watch the video, this character, Franklin, we begin to attach to the benefits of the pole that we prefer as very good things. And the things that are the opposite overuses, they are bad things for us. And so we will work to push the world in that direction. We protect the world from those bad things. So Franklin will protect the world and himself from rigidity. He doesn't want things to be rigid, and he will try to make the world more creative, more adaptive. And he can even begin to say that that's who he is. Excuse me. That I am the person who is creative and adaptable, and I am not rigid and unimaginative, right? And we begin to make that part of our story, if we will. And it goes in both directions. We know that on the other side, there are people who really have a preference for structure, who like the things like efficiency and predictability, and who do not like chaos and waste. Okay, and they will push the world in that direction. And that's a beautiful thing, right? That we have this diversity, but it becomes problematic when we make the other side wrong, right? When we make them wrong because of their preference, and we don't see the beauty that it needs to bring to the conversation. And that's what can really get us stuck and keep us in a position of not being able to move things forward. because we forget that both of those perspectives from a polarity, way of looking at things, both of them are accurate, but neither one is complete. So both people are accurate. Rigidity is not good, creativity is good, chaos is not good, and predictability is good, right? Both of those are accurate arguments and points of view, but neither one is complete because it doesn't take into the full consideration that we actually need creativity and predictability together. And so why this is important in terms of us and the polarized conversations in the church and in the world is that we need to be able to be leaders in the church and leaders in the world that can actually begin to bring both perspectives onto the table if there's a polarity that's at play. And I think that one of the big things here is that there is nothing wrong with a preference. Having a preference is a beautiful thing. But the difference is, do we have the preference or does the preference have us? When we have the preference, then we can make choices and we can act in different ways. But if it has us, we're on autopilot. And so for the polarity that we were just looking at, it's important for us all as leaders to know, what is your preference? Do you lean more in a direction where you see these things, the benefits as really good and these as bad? And so you lean more towards, the pole of focusing on principles and rules, or do you have more of a preference where the things that are here are the most important things to you, and the things that are down here are what are not good for you? And so again, nothing wrong with a preference. It's beautiful as long as we have it. And so we want to give you some time to have a conversation. I'm sorry, to just to reflect for a few moments on which, when you think of these, which pole do you have more of a preference for? Do you focus more and more on the principles and rules, or is it more about the mercy and grace? And I'll put you can either look at the navigator you were working on in the Google Doc, or I'll bring the other one back up. But which of the benefits of that pole seem the most important to you? And which of the overuses of the other pole are most bothersome? So I'll use myself as an example. I'm someone who tends to probably lean more on focus on mercy and grace, tends to be my preference. I know both are important. And to me, what is most important when I look in this is probably for me compassion and connection. Those are both really important to me. And the things down here that are probably the most bothersome are self-righteousness and inauthenticity and hiding, right? And so I know, and I can begin to think about that. So for you, is this more of your preference and what is important and what is bothersome, or is this more of your preference and what is most important to you and what is most bothersome? So I'll give you a moment just to think, because as we go into our next conversations, that's important. And again, nothing wrong with a preference. So I think I will give you a minute to reflect, and then we'll talk about how do we use that? Okay. Again, nothing wrong with a preference, but they really can tie into our narrative, how I see myself in the world, the story that I tell myself about who I am in my community, and who I am not, right? So I am not those things that are the overuses. So as we talk about polarized conversations, what's important is just to tie this in, and what does it mean for polarities, and how do we really put it into action? is that if any of you are familiar with the work that came out of the Harvard negotiation process, that there's the concept that many times in life, right, we will have a position that drives our decisions, it drives our arguments, it drives our answers, our solutions, and that many times those are the things that we talk about. We talk about our positions, and I'll give you an example, around the different solutions that we'd like to see implemented, and we can get stuck because we don't often realize that underneath of our positions, there are always multiple interests. And the interests are the things that drive our positions. They are the things that, they're the values that we have. There are the things that we really, really want that end up driving our position and the conversations that we're having. And what we forget is that many times our positions in the world, they obscure or they hide our interests. The interests aren't as evident as our positions. And underneath of our positions are the interests. And when our positions are based on a polarity, and this is only if it's a polarity, right? There are many times that our arguments and our discussions and the things that we're dealing with are not a polarity. So this may not hold true. But if there is a polarity underneath of our conversation, our interest can really be based on a position, on our preference for a pole. Okay, and those can drive many of our conversations. And so if we tie it back to this idea of what are the interests that undergird our positions, in these conversations, if there is a polarity at play, again, just if it's a polarity, the position can be a preference for a pole. And if that's the case, then all of the interests that drive that position are the things that we want to do to protect the values of the pole, right? To obtain the benefits of the pole, to make sure that we're guarding against or we're overusing the overuses of a pole. Those things can really become the interests that drive our positions. But what happens is that if we're using an either or mindset and we're not tapping into the interests of the people that we're working with to try to move things forward, then we can end up with these zero sum, it's either this way or that way, where we can become really entrenched that my way is right and your way is wrong. And it's either doing it my way or it's doing it your way. And when that happens, then the only thing we can do is we end up in a stalemate. As someone said, people can leave, right? Because the argument isn't going anywhere. The people who are in power win in that case, right? Their positions are the ones that are driven through. And so we might have to compromise and no one's happy because of that compromise. And then a lot of those impacts that we talked about for that suffering that can occur that you put in the chat in terms of, people's relationships being affected and the turmoil that it can actually create within the community. And so want to give you an example of how does this really play out so that then we can apply it to our situation, and your situation in the church. If you think about, the way in which the interests are underneath of our debates, right? And what I'd like to do is I'm going to use an example on a national level, just as an example, so that we can then detach from that and look at inside of the church. And so this plays out very much in the US, which is where I'm based and located, but it is in you look at countries and political systems around the world right now, this is at play. And that one of the big debates everywhere is what do we do about our borders? Right? Are we going to welcome people in, or do we protect our borders? And that is a debate where there's a lot of conflict, back and forth on both sides of the argument. Well, underneath of that, there is a position on one side, which is around what we'll call nationalism, right? Or focus on the part, like what's good for the part, and the things that, really go in from an interest underneath of that, are safeguarding what's ours and having self-reliance, right? Having freedom, not being taken advantage of, and honoring who we are, right? Like those are the interests that undergird, right, that position. And out of that comes the argument, or the stance that we should protect our borders. Okay, and so it's sort of logical, right? If those are what are really driving us as an interest, it's logical that we would come to that stance. On the other side, though, because this is a polarity, there's globalism, right? Or paying attention to the whole, right? Not just our country, but pay attention to the whole of the globe. And the interests that feed into that position are things like, connection to others and not being greedy and selfish and sharing what we have and honoring that there's a shared identity that if we can tap into, there can be synergies, right? And we want to care for one another. And those things feed into the position on the argument around that we need to welcome people. Okay. If we are just fighting, though, over do we protect our borders or open our borders, that conversation will become very stuck very fast. Right. And so this is about how can we get underneath the positions to talk about our interests. So, it also plays out in terms of if you think about these two positions. On one side, it's, well, here in the United States, well, we should exit the Paris Climate Agreement because we need to do what's best for us. On the other side of the argument is that we need to lead as part of that initiative. Okay. We should leave NATO or we should protect NATO, right? On both sides of the argument. We should put America first, or we should put our country first, or we should see ourselves as a global citizen. And so those are the arguments that people are having because we're not paying attention to the interests underneath. Many times what we find is that you may not agree with someone's position, but if you really look at the interests, it's hard to disagree that their interests, right, are all bad, right? But we can make them bad, right? And so because we don't see the value of what's being brought. So in the church, how this might play out, and these are sort of simplified, but there's a lot there. Is that if you look at something around, what about, what are we doing? Is it the primacy of our church doctrine, or are we going to welcome diverse perspectives? Okay, that's an argument, right? That is happening. Okay, when we argue just about that, we likely won't get anywhere until we can look at what are the positions and the interests under both sides of that conversation. And so on one side, if we look at this position of focusing on principles and rules, the things that, the interest of people who hold that position many times are things like, tradition and knowing, and that there's consistency and unity of our approach, that we are, that we are a compass and we can provide a way for the world to move together with, with order, right? And that we can be a moral guide, for the world. Okay, those are all wonderful, beautiful interests that drive the position of putting a primacy, on our doctrine, right? And so on the other side, if for people who have more of the preference for focusing on mercy and grace, the interests for them are maybe, authenticity, connection, acceptance, openness, right? Not being legalistic, making sure that there's healing that is happening, right? And redemption. And out of that, those interests can spring, right? The stance of we should welcome diverse perspectives. Okay. But if we just fight about the things at the top, right, we won't get anywhere. When we begin to look at the interests underneath, that's when we can begin to make progress. And so again, you think about how each of these different positions springs, a stance on what about divorce? On one side, we accept divorce. On the other side, we don't accept divorce. Okay? You can see how things like, the sacraments, who can partake in sacraments, right? Sacraments for people who are morally, aligned, okay, and okay with the church, or sacraments for all, okay? And that can become the debate. Um, do we stick to our liturgical tradition, or do we reform liturgy? Okay. And so all of these things, when you think about them, these different debates, these different arguments, these different conversations that are happening, if we talk about them just at the top without getting to our interests, we will get stuck. And so I think the question really is, for you, is you think about your preference. I had you think, are you more on the principle, side, or are you more on the mercy grace side? Neither side is right or wrong. How might that preference impact how you approach these various debates? To think about how is it that these things actually can drive some of our stances that we have around this. So I just want to do a quick check with our time. And so to think about that for a moment, and yeah, I'm just checking my time. I think we're going to do this as a fast breakout. So I don't know, Pablo, do we need to send them back to their same breakouts? I think so.
If you want them to speak, that's easy.
Yeah. Okay. Well, then why don't we do that? Why don't we go back to our same breakouts?
But Brian, depends on what you think is best now in this next thing, according to the time we have.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's okay. Let's send them back just for it will be a short conversation, so we can give them a little bit longer. But let's go back for just about 4 or 5 minutes to look at how maybe your preference drives different, your different position on these debates. Welcome back. So to continue the conversation, because we want to be able to leave you with some tools to help have different conversations. It's just really important, though, to know the way that our preference might be driving some of our positions, because what that can help us do is to have more compassion for the other side of the conversation, right? Because we see more fully what it is that those parties want, all right, and what their interests are. And Barry Johnson, who's one of my mentors and teachers in this area, one of my favorite quotes of his is that polarities allow us to see others more fully. And the more fully we see someone, the harder it is not to love them, right? And so when we're in these conversations, when we can begin to see the interest, I can be all about mercy, okay, and these things over here. But if I really look at the interests that are driving the other side, those are wonderful interests, right? Like those are wonderful things that I can have compassion for, and both in both directions, right? Both directions, because neither's right or wrong. But what we want to be able to do is get to an idea, and this mentality that if it's a polarity, right, that our positions are both accurate and neither one is complete, right, and that there's a third way, right, that there is a third position. And what I think is so important is to remind ourselves is that when we think about God and we think about the Creator does not have a preference for one of these poles, right? God and creation is on the other side of this polarity, right? Where both things exist at once. And so I always hesitate, when for myself or from others to really think about, I have prayed in God's position, right? That really God does not live on either of the poles, right? God lives beyond, okay, and is beyond. And so how do we begin to have conversations that come more from this place? And part of that is to remember that the way that we ask our questions inside of conversations like this is going to impact the response and the answers that we get. And so if we are asking either or questions, we will get polarized either or responses. And so if we show up with an either or perspective, what we will do is we will do things that will protect this and guard against this, right? Or we'll have conversations that are all about, avoiding this to get more of this. And that's what will drive our positions. And when we have conversations from that spot, we're not going to, go very far. So if I think about, primacy of the church doctrine, if these are the things that are driving me and I'm trying to avoid this, it will drive my stance, right? But when we can get into conversations that say, that stand more in this space of both and, we can begin to ask ourselves, when it comes to this issue, when it comes to liturgical reform, whatever the issue is, what can we do to make sure that we're getting this without losing this? Or when it comes to the acceptance of divorce and and how we honor marriage in the church, what can we do to maintain these things while also bringing these things in? That's when we're talking about interest and we're underneath of the conversation. And it doesn't necessarily make it easy to come up with a solution, but it drives a different type of conversation. Okay. And so the example of that would be, if what did I say last? Divorce. So when it comes to marriage and our stance on marriage and a divorce, or not allowing for divorce, how do we support people who are in the midst of divorce? What is it that we can actually do, right, to have discipline and stand on our tradition while at the same time offering some redemption and space for reconciliation for people? How do we take both of those things into consideration as we're whether it's liturgical reform or any of these types of conversations that we're having? Okay, what can we do to get this without losing this, or get more of this while also bringing in this, and letting that drive the conversation can open up a different dialogue. Okay. And so what I'd like to do is to have us go into some breakouts and to think about, how could you create a both and question, right? So if you think about one of the topics, one of the debates that you are in your community, or in the chart, the universal church, what might that question be? How can we get more of this without losing this, right? Or how can we maintain this and also bring in this? What would you actually say in terms of picking some of these benefits that are important to you, right? How do we maintain our tradition while also, bringing in inclusion? Question mark, right? Because if we just ask the question of how do we maintain our tradition, that's going to set off one thing. Or how do we become more inclusive? That sets off another thing. But when we can ask the both and, it can lead to a different conversation. So in your breakouts, come up with a both and question for yourself, and to think about one of the situations, and how might it actually help you think about or approach it differently. Okay, if you're able to begin to ask these types of questions. So give you some time to think about that as we set up breakouts. And as you're going, I'll say one more thing, which is that as leaders in the church, right, as leaders in the world, we don't have to have all the answers. We just have to know how to ask better questions, right? We have to know how to ask better questions, not have the answers. And so focus now on the question, and then we'll come back. So we will be back in about 9 minutes. Be back in about 9 minutes.
Oui, very fast.
Yes.
Welcome back. As you're coming back, would just be curious if you wanted to maybe into the chat, and maybe if you wanted to type a both and question. What were some of the types of both and questions that you talked about? How could we get more of this without losing? Feel free to place those in the chat for other people to see. Would be interesting. And then just want to tee up one more thing, and then give you a chance to talk about implications. And so really, if we put this into some steps of things that we need to do, or that you can do as a leader, the first thing that would be is that when we're in these types of situation is how do we listen and discern? So how do we listen to the interests and the desires that are underneath of people's stances, underneath of people's positions and their arguments? And so what is what's the deeper good that they're seeking? What's the danger that they're looking to avoid, right? And we can do that by taking the time. It can be easiest to just sort of think about that and to actually to create a map and look at the benefits and the overuses can actually help us begin to see what it is that they want from the benefit side. What is it of our potential overuses that they're trying to avoid? Right. And even realizing that we do have overuses. So creating the map of the benefits and overuses, and then begin to learn how do we ask different questions so that we can learn about them and learn from them. And so you can ask the questions that we just teed up that some people are putting into the chat there is that, when it comes to the issue, whatever the issue is, what would it take for us to get more of this without losing, right? Or when it comes to the issue, what would it take for us to maintain this while also beginning to get some of the other benefits? And so these are some of the steps that you can do to ask different questions. Again, doesn't necessarily mean that the answers will be easy to find, but it brings a different spirit and into the conversation. And so what we'd like to do is I'm going to put into the chat is have one final breakout room to have you just have a quick conversation around, when you think about this approach, because it's just a approach, right? This isn't the solution, right? It is not the, answer. It is just one, one approach. So what would the implication be of being able to ask these types of questions? When you think about your communities, when you think about the church, when you think about the world, what implication might these types of these questions have, right? And everything that we've talked about today. Obviously, it will take some practice to do it, but just to give you a chance to talk about the implications. So thank you for this time. It has been, as always, very fast to have very important conversations like this. So hopefully it's just the beginning for you as you think about this. And just want to end with this, this idea again, that this is really about how do we help people see each other more fully, in these conversations. Because the more fully we see them, the harder it is not to love them, right? And to love what it is that they want and what it is that they're afraid of on both sides of argument.